Welcome to the Film Comment Podcast. I'm Clinton Crute, co-editor of Film Comment. As we enter the dog days of summer, we've been pining for the crisp, air-conditioned darkness of the cinema. Fortunately, as theaters across the country have begun to reopen, seeing a favorite old movie in the dark with other people is no longer a distant dream. For this week's podcast, I sat down with two programmers, Abby Sun and Steve McFarlane, for a broad-ranging conversation about the current repertory landscape. We take a look at what's changed over the past year, for the better or for the worse, and where things might be headed in the near future. We discuss the rapid evolution and proliferation of virtual rep offerings, as well as the programming of the latest Flaherty seminar and several choice offerings from Film Forum and elsewhere. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome to the Film Comment Podcast. I'm very excited to welcome two excellent, smart, affable, well, somewhat affable, but willing guests. Abby, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kim, for having me here. My name's Abby Sun, and I am a freelance, independent curator, writer, grad student at MIT in the Comparative Media Studies department. I run a variety of things at this point in my life, but I'm the curator at the Dockyard, a bi-weekly screening series of new nonfiction films at the Brattle Theater in Harvard Square. And I'm also the co-curator of My Sight is Lined with Visions, a online repertory screening series with Keisha Knight.
It's really a great series. I encourage all the listeners to check it out if they get a chance. And it's something we may talk about a little bit later on if we have time. Steve, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Steve McFarlane. I am a film programmer and volunteer at a variety of venues, but my sort of main hub is Spectacle Theater in Brooklyn, which is a horizontal, all-volunteer nonprofit cinema with this sort of specialized focus on what we used to call lost and forgotten films. Filmmakers don't always enjoy hearing their work positioned that way. And my day job is at the Museum of Modern Art. I've also written for Bomb, CinemaScope, Slant, etc. So yeah, writer, programmer.
Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for joining us. This was originally going to just be a rep report, which is sort of a series of film comment podcasts that we've done where we just kind of look at the repertory scene and pick a couple of series or films and talk about them. But I think right now we're at a really interesting point, turning point in sort of reopening, or maybe sort of it's unclear whether this is a turning point because of various variant concerns and whatnot. But I know a lot of theaters have been reopening lately, so there's a lot more in-person screenings going on. And so this virtual landscape that had come to kind of dominate viewing for the last year and change is in a sort of interesting transitional place. And this is something I know Abby has thought a lot about in her work. And I know that she also thought a lot about it before this podcast. She mentioned before we started recording that she'd been looking into kind of what theaters were doing and how they were reopening. Abby, what did you find?
Yeah, so I think I'd like to start by kind of drawing a couple of distinctions first. As somebody that has never lived in New York or LA, I think we tend to talk about programming and this type of creative work only in kind of centers of production and of cultural prestige and all of that. And one thing that did kind of happen during the pandemic that I want to just sort of give a shout out to at first was the launching of kind of repertory focused streaming services as people are positioning them. And I think this is a kind of interesting move because it's not directly emulating the theater model, but rather like something that is bounded by discrete screenings in the evening or a set time, but really kind of a streaming model. This might be closer to like, I don't know, a list of films to watch, like a YouTube playlist or something like that.
Can you give some examples?
Yeah, so this would include things like, some of them are for free. This would include Another Gazes, Another Screen, which is not regularly programmed, but every couple of months something pops up, always for free. It's subtitled in at least like 15 languages, which is itself an incredible feat. But this also causes some problems because they were free, they were using Vimeo, And once you hit a certain amount of bandwidth on Vimeo, Vimeo does reach out to accounts and charges exorbitant, I'm talking $10,000 in order to continue to host the screening series. And then there's also things like Habibi Collective's Shasha streaming service on what they call, also British-based, Swana, Southwest Asia, and Northern Africa and Middle Eastern, I guess in the US, Lingo Films. And that's programmed by Washin Taponi. And she's also hosting some screenings, I believe, at virtual MoMA kind of web screenings, I think. So that's kind of an interesting position because I would totally consider it repertory programming, but they are being kind of advertised as streaming services instead.
Would you consider this to be kind of a phenomenon that arose in response to the pandemic? Or, I mean, the sort of thing was going on to a certain extent before, but it seems like it's really kind of blossomed. Is that your impression?
Yeah, so from what I know of the history of Another Days and Habibi Collective sponsoring screenings and putting on screenings is that they were hosting, co-hosting, curating in-person one-off screenings in the past, all repertory screenings still at, in real life theaters. And so I do think part of the urge for something like this is to continue to hold that space when it becomes online. But I think it is also a little bit of a surprise because another screen was launched with the Sarah Maldor series, which was endorsed and with the participation of the filmmaker's daughters.
Which was, I think, in like April 2020,
it was
right?
Really soon. Yeah, it was like one of the earliest ones.
We talked about that on the Film Comment podcast at the time.
Yeah, I mean, it was really, I think, the thing that kind of put the idea into Keisha and our head that we could do My Sight is Lined with Visions, because this was something that they launched kind of in a super DIY style because they didn't have a site for it. What they did was anyone who wanted to watch the screenings, right, would have to email for the link. And it was just a Vimeo link of the film. And then you would sign up and they would send you a Zoom link of the panel conversation. So it wasn't like posted on a website. It wasn't.
Now, I mean, the web design now for Another Screen is like beautiful.
Yeah, and it's all Daniela Schwer. She does it all herself. But I think it's as much a function of, from what I understand, like financial necessity as it is, I think, from the desire to make something that is handmade. And I think in contrast, kind of in the US, when I saw actual brick and mortar cinemas, even ones that did specialize in repertory screening, like the Gene Siskel, the Roxy Theater in San Francisco, they didn't really spend a lot of time maintaining their repertory screenings online.
Right.
So when these theaters are reopening now, and a lot of them reopened just this month or August, or haven't even announced their reopening, a lot of the university cinematheques like Harvard Film Archive, the Block Cinema for Northwestern University, haven't publicly announced when they're going to reopen. But for instance, the theaters that have reopened have gone with kind of what we would consider the blockbuster. People are going to show up for a 7-film retrospective, Fellini retrospective, which is what the Gene Siskel is opening with, for instance. That people are going to show up for, I don't know, staff picks, which is the only thing that the Roxy is reopening with for their repertory screening when they used to do this every weekend.
And of course, Anthology Film Archives, as Steve mentioned, is opening with the blockbuster Paul Sherritt's double 16mm projection restoration. But one thing that you said that I wanted to touch on was the fact that a lot of these bigger repertory theaters didn't really transition into the virtual space smoothly in the same way that another screen organizations like that were able to do that. Why might that be the case? Steve, do you want to talk about Spectacle's pioneering efforts in the virtual cinema space?
Sure. I mean, we've all sort of now learned how to make it work. I would give the credit for that, though, to Caroline Gollum, who sort of rammed through this initiative to do spectacle programming on Twitch. I think that started maybe even like the last day of March with Empty Metal, and it was really fun. The filmmakers were actually in the chat. It's not my preferred way to watch a film, chatting the whole time, but there is a certain electric energy that people get from it. We were doing that not every single day, but at least something every week. through the fall in honor of Spectacle's 10th anniversary, which of course we had this big in-person program we were kind of building towards. We had a Twitch mystery double feature of Marco Ferreri's The Seed of Man, followed by Themrock by Claude Ferraldo, which actually, there was so much nudity in Themrock that it got us banned from Twitch, like with 10 minutes of the movie left, the channel, the stream just disappeared, the whole, account. At first we were pretty upset, but it's also kind of a good, no bad publicity kind of thing, but because of that, another volunteer named Kellen Dye, who actually knows how to program computer shit, not just films, built a streaming platform, which we now use, hosted on our own website, which can be geo-blocked. And we haven't yet set up ticketing for that, but we're hoping to eventually, just so we can start to generate some revenue again. But all of the streams have been free. And a lot of that has been thanks to the, generosity of filmmakers like Adam Khalil, Bailey Schweitzer, et cetera, who were willing to sort of let us host their work in this kind of new virtual space. So that toothpaste is out of the tube, even if we do manage to reopen on September 1st, which I've been working almost every day on that. And now I'm kind of like with this Delta shit, I'm like, okay, I don't know. But even if we do that, we're going to have to continue streaming, basically. And so now we're trying to find ways to have the programs work in this kind of two-tier, two-pronged offensive kind of way where you could come see the movie in person, but how do we retain that audience that's now sort of, global?
There's a labor issue there too, right? Where you have now like twice as much work to do. In terms of like matching these programs, coordinating them.
I would say virtual is actually more work
than in person. Yeah. It's actually like
10 times the amount of work, because when the pandemic lockdown started, I'm the only Dockyard employee at the time. I immediately moved everything online. And this is before platforms like Eventive and Cinesend and Shift 72 had really been developed. Not that the organization that I work for can afford those anyway, because that costs a lot of money. But I think what happened to Spectacle on Twitch because of the content restrictions on Twitch is a really good example of platform politics, actually. And I think it actually, so there's this idea that when things move online, it's more free, more accessible, more democratic, more, free from censorship and things like that. And I think while that may be the case for certain political matters, it does actually help authoritarian governments and entities conduct surveillance, right? Things are much more traceable online. And also it makes organizations subject to a lot of really hard to find policies. These are all buried in terms of services and things like that for these platforms, such as Vimeo being unlimited bandwidth until you hit a completely undefined number. They don't publish it on their website. It's buried in an FAQ that says if you reach the top 1% of bandwidth users, a customer service representative will reach out to you.
And this was one of the reasons why we didn't go with Vimeo Premium, even though that appeared to be one of the more affordable options. Like the platforms you described, Shift 72, those cost thousands and thousands of dollars to get rigged up and also take a lot of time. So one more example.
They also charge per play on top of the startup fees, even if it's a free screening. And they also have additional charges for bandwidth too, because one of the things these platforms do is they also provide kind of the things that Vimeo and all of them provide internally, CDNs. We don't need to get into this, but it basically affects how fast the video loads when somebody's playing.
But I would even say, you're talking about both data tracking and means of accessibility for the viewer. But another example, very pernicious, since we were talking about another screen, weren't they were raising money for Palestinian relief organizations, and they were blocked, I think, by, I can't remember if it was it Venmo? Was it?
Yeah, I think it was GoFundMe or whatever they were raising on.
They were just soliciting donations, I believe, right?
Yeah, this is Films for a Free Palestine screening series of films made by Palestinian women filmmakers.
Incredible program.
A series that we also did we did a podcast about a month or two ago.
Totally jaw-dropping. And also it's amazing, the program notes and all of the kind of extra filmic discourse that they build around the works too. The essays that are posted. I mean, again, the captioning, I mean, the subtitling, it's like totally amazing work. But yeah, I think you're totally right. And I think, when then an organization, when the platform itself then like Vimeo reaches out under ostensibly like bandwidth violation issues, it does also bring up the question for a project like Another Screen, like, is it actually the bandwidth violations, or was the bandwidth violation like actually triggered by political censorship also, or political sensitivity? I think, when you're dealing with a private entity where you don't have a formal way of contesting charges, other than just, begging the customer service representative who's contacting you, you really don't know what's going on.
Another example, kind of in a different vein, is the cinephobe.tv, which I think was actually hosted on a Russian server. I guess it still is. They're still streaming. Is that?
I think they just came back a couple days ago, last week.
Okay. That was kind of an early success story in terms of an online program getting a lot of heat from people in what I would consider to be the cinephile community for making things available, unrestricted, ungeoblocked, unticketed. The problem, I guess, is that, most of this media, like the actual files that were being streamed, probably, I would imagine, came from torrent sites, the likes of which, a theater like Spectacle would be not taken seriously for, perhaps even prosecuted for showing from 10 years ago. Right. So on the one hand, they're deprivileging access to rare, interesting foreign films for people who are not fluent with those websites. But if you are a distributor, an archivist, if you work for an archive, if you have access to those keys, it's probably a real headache. And I think they did a really good job of advertising and targeting people who want to learn more about cinema, want like a deeper, sort of more nuanced appreciation of what's out there beyond the like established canon, but maybe are not on this like film nerd dark web, that makes these kinds of websites possible. So like everything, it's a mixed blessing,
It's like just sort of like a normie torrent.
Well, no, I mean, it's if you've never been able to see a Rogue Rie film, and then it's like, oh, it's streaming for free at 4 a.m. Let me set my alarm. It's great. But, how those relationships would, for example, be sustained if that were a platform that had to go back into the IRL space, where they're figuring out how they could clear these programs. That's where it gets tricky.
Well, I don't think they would, right? It seems pretty clear that they would not be operating.
No.
It seems that they were only operating because of because of the circumstances in which they came, into existence. And it's not totally clear that they will continue to exist going forward.
I guess I just want to interject at this point and say that, as somebody that grew up in mid-Missouri, the existence of a site like Cineprobe is quite interesting because it was from torrents where I originally saw a lot of films as a teenager, right? And for instance, there is a market, for instance, for reselling physical media copies, like perhaps, the uploading of torrents is sort of how that gets redone. But also, I guess, there is the relationship between kind of like official, or like by reputation, people that work through the official channels, distributors, right holders in order to access films. For me as a programmer, if we can't convince a filmmaker to do something, we're not going to show the film, right. So on and so forth. But, there has been always an informal and bootleg economy where these things aren't just passed around for free, like for torrents, but are actually sold for profit when it comes to bootleg DVDs and copies of VHS tapes and things like that. So to me, like, I guess I'd be curious, Steve or Clint, if you guys have any idea, how is something like Cineprobe different than like somebody ripping something and putting it onto YouTube?
It seems to be very similar. It just happens to be 24 hours a day, and there's no time slots. So it's just a continuous stream of films. Like you go to the website and you open it and you're in the middle of Raoul Walsh's Colorado territory. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of obscure films that they program, but also a lot of stuff that's not impossible to find necessarily. it's sort of a curatorial project in that regard. But I think that's kind of the interesting difference to me. The old stories of going into the theater and they're playing like 5 different movies and you come in the middle and then you wait until you get all the way back to the point at which you came back in, type of thing. The bootleg idea, I think, is interesting as an ethical question, because I think there's 2 sides to that, right? One is access, which is like people in Western Colorado, where I grew up, we weren't able to see. There was no way. I wanted to see Monty Hellman's Cockfighter. I knew about it, but there was literally no way I could have ever seen it. Now, 16-year-old Clint could probably would see that it was on Cinephobe and like set his alarm for 4 a.m. to watch it. And I don't know if that would necessarily improve my life, but I would like to think that that access might improve somebody's life. But on the other hand, I think, the other side of that coin is the artist, really, and respecting their wishes, both legally and ethically. But yeah.
Well, I mean, as someone who grew up on the internet, I don't want to be mistaken for shilling on behalf of, big copyright holding companies, getting sand kicked in their eyes by like a few people watching an internet stream, but it's also interesting. Like, for example, Abby's program, My Site is Lined with Vision. Most of these filmmakers are still alive and totally active on the internet. And that makes it a different conversation from, a musty film from the 1930s that's in some vault somewhere that was never going to escape on its own. Like, I've had a lot of interesting conversations with filmmakers trying to have this spectacle program sort of exist in the online sphere and then hopefully return to the physical one. But like, do you want people to see your movie, or do you want a check for 750 euros that's going to happen once every 3 years? You know what I mean? Like,
right.
It's sort of like this bizarre, you think about it institutionally, it's like, what does my cinema need to do to be able to preserve those relationships, whether they're with distributors or filmmakers? But then it's also like, this has been, for better and for worse, a great opportunity to share things with more people who don't live in New York, Los Angeles, Paris, whatever, but the bittersweet part for me, and I don't know how you feel about this, Abby, is I didn't get into any of this because I liked watching movies on my computer or even plugging an HDMI cord into my laptop and watching it on my wall. I like going to the cinema, being in that moment of sort of held, hushed collective experience, and to watch it come back and now sort of balkanize and break down has been really interesting too.
You're listening to the Film Comment Podcast. Sign up today for the Film Comment Letter. It's a free weekly digital newsletter featuring original film criticism and writing by Film Comment's editors and brilliant contributors.
The letter delivers exclusive features, reviews, interviews, streaming picks, news, and more directly to subscribers' inboxes every Thursday before they're published on filmcomment.com the following Monday.
Sign up today at filmcomment.com.
Just to respond first to the idea of like, how do you also show works in new formats, or maybe in spaces where you're not entirely sure what the filmmaker's wishes would be. And then also a lot of this work it's not even clear who actually legally owns the rights, right?
Right.
Like a lot of this work, like it's completely like, an archive might hold it, but they actually might not own the rights. And the last person who is the rights holder was like a family member that they're no longer in touch with. And now there are all these places that hold copies of it, but it's like impossible to have, because if you're dealing with an archive, their mission, their mandate is not to distribute the film. It's to preserve it and to keep on holding on to it, right?
And they can often provide access for research purposes, but for any kind of public screenings.
And then on the other hand, there are filmmakers, especially those that work in the moving image space, but also some who don't, who do have a priority to keep their work more exclusive because they don't want it commoditized as an object. They don't want it, for whatever reason, like the materiality is going to degrade, so they don't want to show the print too many times or whatever the reason is. Or it's an art object that's already owned by 5 institutions. So at that point, they no longer want to show it outside of those institutions. But for me, kind of all of those concerns aside too, I think that there's so much out there this is kind of the issue with repertory screening. That's something like Cineprobe or what Spectacle does, or what happened when we first launched My Sight is Lined with Vision, in which you're showing repertory screenings without pegging it to some sort of restoration or digitization effort, right? Which makes it more of a newsy thing, or some sort of anniversary or someone's birth or someone's death, right? Like those are the things that all of these screenings, or it's not wraparound programming, like it's the old films of, Justin Lin's first films when F9 is playing. It's like hard to, it feels like to a lot of people that it's hard to generate the interest in something like this, which is, I think, why we get like these super conservative reopening repertory programs at theaters where they're doing, like, if it's a theater that does more experimental work, it's like Bruce Biley, which is what Roxy is partnering with Canyon Cinema on doing. And I love both of these places, but this to me is kind of like the most expected thing ever. For me, out of those institutions, for instance. And I think that's like an ongoing problem. And that's an ongoing problem outside of New York or LA, when the only repertory programming that is shown are the things that have restorations. And then you're like tying these things that I think should be falling outside of, I mean, if it's repertory, then it shouldn't matter, you know, how new it is or kind of the newsworthiness of some of these things, but it ties even the thinking behind that type of programming even more and more into kind of the commodity object of the film.
Yeah, we're not really seeing the like thematic series being programmed at these theaters yet, it seems.
Yeah, not right now. And, you know, it's something that's the thing that I miss.
It seems like they've really migrated to like Criterion Channel, as every week it's another thematic series programmed by many programmers who once did work for a lot of these institutions as well.
It's the future of repertory programming and streaming services.
I mean, but as you've said, it's more difficult in many ways to program for streaming services, right? I guess if you have an institution behind you, it's maybe a little bit easier to work through the...
Well, one critical distinction I've been trying to remind people for like the last, I don't know, year and a half is that the films and the programs that are available on the Criterion Channel are not limited to movies that are distributed by Janus Films, right? And once that shift was made, that they could start leasing from, you know, whatever's left of the major studios from their archives, it opens up just this whole other galaxy of programming variety. In some ways, it's almost too much. Like I just get overwhelmed with all the options, you know.
It's totally overwhelming. I mean, I think this is what Abby was touching on too, is this like glut of choice.
But the glut is also interesting because there was a glut, maybe not like March 2020, but I think by May 2020, virtual cinemas had figured out how to exist. Brick and mortar cinemas had figured out how to move their programming onto a VOD type basis. And now that's completely dried up, not in terms of the programming available, but in terms of people's enthusiasm for watching movies at home, you know, post-vaccine, pre-Delta, whatever. Almost every programmer I've talked to who actually has tried to like earn revenue off of that type of programming is really struggling right now. And, you know, maybe with cold season or with another lockdown or with another variant, whatever, there's going to be another chance to like recoup that interest again. But, you know, Film Forum, you know, I interviewed Karen Cooper for a piece I wrote for Hyperallergic, which the piece ended up being a little apocalyptic, but it was basically like, you know, they were not making the same amount of money with streaming, with rentals. They were not able to sustain their operation on that revenue. I think it's interesting that as of right now, they're back to full capacity in-person screenings. And I have to say it feels a little bit, that can't last, right? I feel like, you know, with the virus doing what it's doing, I think we are going to go back to limited capacity or, you know, more distant seating. This is too many different angles to consider. But the life cycle of this like virtual cinema boom, I find very interesting. And I don't know what the future looks like.
Yeah, I don't think anybody really can right now. The last year has really laid bare the lack of limitations that exist for virtual programming, because I think you could just continually, I mean, to the point in terms of just actually doing the programming, getting people to watch, I think is where you're saying there are like some serious limitations, right? Like getting eyeballs on the screen.
I don't want to hog the mic, but in terms of spectacle, the priority has sort of shifted in terms of like, now we really do have to find things that are not available through those torrent sites, not available through VOD, you know, And if you're Anthology, which is a, much longer standing institution, I think the priority, I mean, their online programming has also been amazing, and a lot of it has been free worldwide. We could just do a list of all the amazing online programs and it would take more than an hour and a half. But what I would say is that with their physical reopening, obviously the emphasis is on something that is probably expected, their restoration of Paul Sherritt's Razor Blades, but that is a dual projection 16 millimeter event. You can't really stream that, right? So it's like you have to make things more exclusive in the physical space and less exclusive in the online space. But also, as a programmer, for me, the challenge is like to dig deeper and find things that are even further off the map, which is fun, but also extenuating,
Yeah.
There is kind of another model for the online virtual repertory programming.
There is another world. There's another possibility.
Because I agree. What Karen said for your piece is, I think, what's been reflected across the country. I mean, people who are kind of the brick and mortar theaters, but also even for like our series, My Side Assigned Musicians, which is one that we are charging tickets for, or it's a rental period, to use the lingo of the virtual cinema. There was a lot of interest in May 2020 for My Side Assigned Musicians, so much so that we relaunched it for an entire year, from January of this year to January of next year. But our sales for this entire year have just matched what we made for just 10 days from May last year. And so we really saw this kind of drop off of interest. Part of it really surprises me, and I find it amazing that people are still renting films from us. But the other thing that we did do was a lot of the filmmakers who, for the first series, we were just ripping their films off of DVDs because like their hard drives were locked in their offices at universities and people were getting kicked off, so on and so forth. So honestly, the image quality was awful. Like if this were any time before the pandemic, I never would have even entertained like selling tickets to a quote unquote screening like that. Like it just would have been unacceptable in my mind. And then a lot of them digitally restored or actually, located their, files of their rescans. So in my opinion, like the films look better than ever. But I guess I just want to give a shout out to the Flaherty seminar, because this was an entirely, it's like one of the longest independent running film events in the country, if not the world. I think they're on like 65 or 66 Flaherty seminars or something like that. And they did cancel last year because the idea was that this is an experience that can never be replicated online. But they did move things online. They did drastically drop the ticket price because it used to be more than $1,500 to attend for a week. For US-based attendees, it was $450 this year. And if you were in a list of kind of third world underdeveloped countries or had financial difficulties, you could email them. And I think the discounted price was $150 US. And they spread it out over 10 days, two generally 2-hour screening slots a day, discussions that were scheduled to be 1 hour but generally lasted 90 minutes to 2 hours. This included like breakout rooms, virtual parties. They had like an in-person party at Union Docks as well. But I mean, the thing that really surprised me, I don't know how many people watched the screenings, but they did tell everyone that over 450 people registered for the seminar at those prices. And what I saw during the virtual discussions was over 200 people participating and in the Q&As and chatting.
That's a lot of people. So in order to attend the Q&As, do you have to register?
So it was kind of like a hybrid, like everything model in terms of what they did. So you have to be registered for the seminar to get the links. But I do think that a lot of people were also informally, watching together. I, for one, was definitely watching with some of my roommates who were just passing by. You can't really tell people, like people who live with you can't watch these films with you. And they were doing like group watching sessions from Union Docks and a couple of other areas where there were multiple registrants were watching together. And then every screening basically had like a 3-hour viewing window where you could start watching it. And then it was taken down after that. And then the discussions were only live. But they also had the Flaherty Fellowship Program. There's like 20 fellows every single year who are separate than the participating filmmakers. Every single fellow basically was assigned to take extensive notes during the live virtual discussion after the screening, so that if you had to miss a discussion, you could read kind of the extremely extensive notes that were taken. And they also saved the chat archive and transcript for everyone. So I don't know that this is entirely replicable because, of course, the Flaherty is an entire institution that spends a full calendar year on planning this one event, along with the Flaherty Fall New York screenings. So it takes a lot of effort, but they had to custom build the platform because of the way things would have to be timed. They had to custom build during the virtual discussions themselves. The idea was that most people would be in chat, because otherwise this would be like a 200-person Zoom, right? And it would be entirely overwhelming. And then kind of the speakers and the moderators were on stage. They were spotlit in larger windows, but they had up to 12 smaller boxes where people from the audience could basically volunteer to have their faces shown on screen and basically have their reactions visible. So they kind of like mixed everything together that I've seen recently.
It seems like a good way to, I'm wary of using this term, but like eventize.
Exactly.
Eventize the repertory world a little bit more. But, and that might help distinguish that programming from the glut that we were talking about a little bit. I don't know.
Well, I think, this is, in some ways, it's a very unique kind of combination of things. As Abby pointed out, they had a year plus change to develop towards this one type of event, but I hope and I believe it will probably pay off for them.
It sounds like based on the attendance, right?
Yeah, I think, one thing that's been exposed by all this is that organizations, whether they're nonprofit or whether they are just companies that rely exclusively on ticket revenue to stay alive, are going to have a much harder time than organizations that have already found alternative sources of funding because of their mission or because of their, structure. And that's not to say that people shouldn't be, filmmakers shouldn't be paid per stream or whatever. It's not an argument like that. It's just that, the short-term fix of selling X number of tickets to stay afloat versus people, donating from out of pocket because they like what you're doing, like the Another Screen model. I don't know the numbers, but I would just say it shows that there's different ways that you can sustain yourself as a repertory programmer, different from the 20th century physical theater thing of just like packing the house and, making it as big of a deal as you can. But, I'm sure people are also excited to go back to the in-person Flaherty, even if that's now 2023 or something like that,
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think your point earlier about not wanting to just watch things on your screen, on your computer screen, is well taken. I definitely agree with that.
But it's a false binary to say that it's all the one thing or all the other, because these types of discussions and online events, I think, have really enriched what film programming can actually be.
And provided more access.
In some ways, it makes me feel like we were in denial about the internet by focusing so rigorously on in-person, in-theater programming. I mean, literally February 2020, we were joking about Spectacle Premium memberships, which would be like a bootleg phone stream of whatever movie is playing in the theater, to people who paid a certain monthly fee. And now it's like, that's kind of where, the file quality is better, but it became like the norm in a certain way,
I still think there's something there. That seems like a good idea. The bootleg version. Abby, you'd mentioned wanting to shout out some filmmakers' work that you saw at the Flaherty, right?
Because I feel a little embarrassed, like talking about the Flaherty seminar and like, oh, this is all the things that they did digitally, right, without actually talking about some of the films that were there. And what's kind of interesting about something like the Flaherty is that they've always kind of moved fluidly. The curators, it's a rotating curator every year, have always been encouraged to, show works by moving image artists as well as feature filmmakers. The focus is on documentary, but fiction films get shown there all the time. So there were works by kind of the Plastic Films Collective out of Brazil. This is including Andre Noves Oliveira, who made Temporada, which played at New Directors, New Films a couple of years ago, which is where I saw it originally, as well as the films of Grace Passo, who is a theater director in Brazil and who is the lead actor in Temporada, but also makes her own films. And one thing that I found interesting with this Flaherty, for instance, is that several of Grace Passo's films are actually available for free online because she made them as commissions for like kind of digital streaming sites in Brazil, essentially. This included something that's called Courage TV, which is it's all for free. And it's kind of just commissions from performance artists and theater actors and theater directors and writers during the pandemic. And to kind of have this stuff that was created specifically for virtual exhibition being shown alongside like Isaac Julian's work and the work by artists who only even rarely do video installations, like Deanna Bowman, who lives and works in Canada these days. I believe she teaches at Concordia, but her family is from the US Deep South. Like, to me, there was something also even more interesting that was happening there as well. But I wanted to say I was like most struck by the work of Morgan Quaintance, who is a writer and filmmaker, British writer and filmmaker, and Open City Documentary Film Festival has just announced their online repertory screening for the festival in September. And Morgan is in conversation with Luke Fowler, the filmmaker. So there's a way to see Morgan's work next, I believe.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds fascinating.
One of the filmmaking collectives that was shown at the Flaherty was the Sudanese Film Group, which is essentially 4 or 5 Sudanese filmmakers who have been censored by the regime there since the 70s, none of whom have really made any films since then, but have been trying to preserve their own work and to start cinemas in Khartoum since then. And Arsenal restored a lot of their works under the Sudanese Film Group collection about 3 years ago, I believe in 2018. And it is showing right now, this is in late July. I don't know when it's closing. I think it might be closing on like August 5th at MoMA virtually. But it's only one part of 6 parts of Arsenal restoration. And what I find really interesting is that even in this kind of virtual sphere, the grouping is what I consider quite conservative and old school, and that it's like North African cinema and Georgian cinema and Brechtian cinema. You know, it's got all of these kind of nationalized divisions and all of that. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. But we are talking about MoMA, the kind of institution, right, at this point.
Yeah. It's also at this point, I mean, I think to pull together some threads that we've been talking about, like the restoration being the thing that triggers interest in repertory programming, right? And also the fact that it's an institution like Arsenal, which I would, has this huge amount of weight and huge amount of state funding that's actually collecting the films from maybe places that were former colonies of Germany as well. And then also being the institution, the organization, the driving force behind spreading the cultural production of, colonized peripheral places to institutions like the MoMA. So I think there's a lot to read into on the fact that like these are the repertory programs that are the ones that are continuing at these institutions at this time.
Yeah, not to get too theoretical again, but I kind of am more interested in that aspect of this conversation. But I do think it's very interesting to think about how this virtual space has turned work like that into content to a certain extent. These series sometimes seem to be generated, and maybe this is just a poor reading on my part or a not very generous reading. But there's always a need for something new, so we're not pegging it to restoration, but we have to find something new. So that you're digging deeper and deeper into these archives. I mean, this seems actually like a pretty interesting series. Not to pick on the Arsenal series, but I wonder how much the fact that it is virtual colors it that way. Maybe is more my question. By not giving it the prestige of the IRL screening, do these films become more easily dismissed or more easily processed as web content? I mean, is that a distinction that's valuable?
to Abby's point about the organization of those series and the kind of the pitching or the packaging, to use, those sound like pejorative terms. I don't mean it that way, but this whole experience of negotiating all of this constantly, I think, does place higher stress on conceptual programming, like my site is lined with visions, to cite one example. In terms of, just because something is new, what does it mean to be new? New to the cinephile community, new to Letterboxd, like newly available online. Sometimes something has been sitting there on YouTube in full for years with like 12 views because nobody took the time to like package it, give it a sexy hook, give it some good graphic design, whatever. And I think that the programmer's job is not just to, break new ground in terms of like leasing new restorations, but also to create audiences for things. I used to want to believe that one pithy spectacle series, would be enough to put this or that filmmaker on the map, or this film. And now, unfortunately, I kind of feel like you have to be as redundant and shill as hard at every possible opportunity if you're dealing with something that doesn't have this sort of built-in audience already, So maybe that series, the organization of that series, in some way is testament to, not the museum taking its connections to a archive like Arsenal for granted, but just sort of if you build it, they will come kind of notion of organizing cinema in these rather, as you're saying, conservative kind of old-fashioned blocks. To me, it reminds me of like going to the video store in the 90s and seeing, world cinema, which is not the same pitch as my site is lined with visions, or, something that really kind of makes you want to like dig deeper, It's not just about file scarcity or even the newness of a restoration. I think you can basically create an audience for this or that film. I think it's wider open than a lot of programmers are seeing it, because so much of the accessibility has been dictated by whatever, money, archival relationships, I mean, Spectacle is lucky because we can show low-grade media without it being some sort of violation of our quality standards. If you're holding out for a film to be restored by, Macron or by Scorsese or somebody like that, it may never happen. Whereas if you show the bad DVD rip enough times and you build enough of a consensus and an audience around it, it might be likelier that someone will pay attention and initiate that process, which is still not guaranteed for any film, really, unless it's Fellini or Bergman or something like that. Like
it is interesting though, like the chicken and egg problem of repertory screening and what generates what, because two of the films out of My Site is Lined with Visions, there's only 7 feature-length programs, recently got approval for restoration through the American Film Preservation Association. So it's true. It's like I guess that's something that's hard to explain to people too, that, it doesn't have to be U8. I kind of feel like in a lot of ways, when I talk to programmers, they're like waiting for things to sort of be given to them by distributors. Like the packaging is already in place, so right. You don't have to do it yourself, right? And the restoration has already been done, so that doesn't have, so then you don't have to think of another way to justify or try to like convince people, or like try to have to do so much work to build an audience for it. And to me, this is kind of paralleling what I hear from a lot of filmmakers about the distribution apparatus itself, where they expect for the distribution to be given to them by a distribution company. But none of these things are things that we have to ask for permission for. We can create these things ourselves. And that's why I find Spectacle so amazing. Like when the Twitch stream popped up, I immediately sent it to Keisha and we both watched. We were like, it like blew our minds. We were like, okay, we can do our own thing as well. So
it's really heartening to hear that. For all the knocks that I might have given Film Forum, for example, they're having a massive Humphrey Bogart retrospective, which is simultaneously extremely my thing and, beyond played as far as New York repertory programming is concerned. They are showing a new restoration, and that's the hook, is that it's a new restoration of Brigitte Behrman's documentary about the jazz musician Bix Beiderbecke, which this film has been completely unavailable to see for 40 years, basically.
Wait, that's part of the Bogart?
No, sorry, that's its own thing. I mean, I'm kind of looking for examples of repertory programming that kind of perked my ears up. And this is probably the first one they've had since they reopened.
I thought maybe Bogart appeared as like a talking head or something.
Well, Louis Armstrong, and but it's an interesting sort of linchpin for all of these conversations, because I've never seen this film. I've seen her other documentary about the jazz musician Artie Shaw, which is one of the most incredible docs I've ever seen as a portrait of an artist through their processes and through their life and through their ups and downs. And I don't know about Bix, but that film is still unavailable to see because of music copyright issues relating to the Artie Shaw estate. So, that's a different way in which a film sort of kept under wraps for decades, for this or that reason, just to say like, and that's not on those torrent sites even. I saw that at MoMA on a 35 millimeter print because I think they have one. But
that's maybe a good point for us to wrap up, because it shows you're talking about these theaters beginning to program in real life again, as we've talked about. And I think that there's, we denigrate the Bogart series at our own risk here, because I think that that's like something that I would be very excited to, pop into Film Forum, a couple times a week to check out. And the Bix documentary also sounds really fascinating. And thanks for highlighting that. And I also want to check out this Artie Shaw. You're going to have to figure out a way to clear that music.
I'm probably just going to ask the filmmaker at the Q&A, how can I watch that movie again?
Yeah. I think that's a good strategy. Also, come on, the estate, like this has got to help the estate, right?
I think Artie Shaw might have had something to do with the film's suppression, actually, but that's how it's a good artist documentary.
The only thing I really know about Artie Shaw is that he once hit somebody on the head with his clarinet who was, mean to Billie Holiday or something. Is that the story?
There's all kinds of corporal punishment stories in the documentary. I don't know about that one, but he was a real character. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll save that one for the old timey jazz episode of the Film Comment podcast. Thank you guys both for coming on. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I hope to have you on again sometime soon.
Thank you, Clint.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abby.
Bye.
Bye. The Film Comment podcast features original music by Greg Einge. Film Comment is a publication of Film at Lincoln Center. Since 1962, Film Comment has been the home of independent film journalism, publishing in-depth interviews, critical analysis, and feature coverage of mainstream, art house, and avant-garde filmmaking from around the world. Visit us online at filmcomment.com.